In Dwight Wilson, Armageddon Now, the Premillenarian Response to Russia and Israel since 1917, we're now at chapter 4, and the title of the chapter is The Twenties Roar Faintly, Bear, Beast, and Young Lions. He starts with a quote from a famous Christian authoress of that day, Christabel Pankhurst. In her book, The Lord Cometh, 1923, she said, "The current international events are assuredly fingerposts to Armageddon." And then he quotes from two magazines of the day, the Pentecost Evangel of 1928, which said, "Here you have read that Russia is going to war with Palestine. That is coming. There is where we are today. Therefore, we may expect very shortly that this conflict will take place." And from the King's Business in 1929, we have this. If the writer should hazard a prediction, he would be inclined to say that the outcome of the present situation will finally confirm the Jewish claim and will eventually speed up developments for setting the stage for the final act of the end of the age. Wilson says the pietistic holiness strain in premillenarian thought prevented participation in the high living uproar of the 1920s, but there was excited anticipation as the circus menagerie of biblical symbols faintly roared in the caverns of Time's Stadium, restlessly awaiting the fatal rush to the arena. The Russian bear recovered providentially from the dual wounds of war and revolution, and premillenarians continued the traditional game of bear baiting. The identity of the beast, sometimes called Antichrist, was not quite so clearly recognized, being variously represented as Mussolini, the League of Nations, or, more traditionally, the Catholics, or the papacy. America's growing nationalism and recent rise as a world power necessitated the discovery of a significant prophetic role for this new major power. America was accordingly identified as a young lion of British pedigree, destined to stand with Britain in the final struggle of the age. This seems to be a reference to the Gog and Magog passage in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39. As premillenarians reflected on the years of the war, they continued to see the hand of God in it all. God's greatest purpose in the World War was to shake Palestine free from the grip of the Turk, according to the King's Business in its regular feature section, The Chosen People, the Land and the Book, Notes Concerning the Jews and Prophecy. The writer admitted that there were other purposes, but this was the greatest. The freedom of the Jews to return to Palestine as a result of the war proved that God was still alive and at work on behalf of Israel. Therefore, quote, all believers ought to rejoice in this fresh evidence of the interest of God in men. Unquote. This purpose of the war was regarded as the budding of the fig tree of Luke 21:29-31, and as an indication that the kingdom of God is nigh. The Pentecostal Evangel linked major turning points of the war directly to the hand of God in Palestine, saying it is a remarkable fact that when Turkey surrendered, Britain had just captured the last portion of the Promised Land. And the most significant feature of the late war was the retaking of this whole biblical territory. When this was accomplished by General Allenby, war ceased. That's a comment on the capture of Jerusalem by Allenby in 1917. End of quote. Speaking of the Zionist movement, one evangel writer said, and this is a fellow called Howitt, that I'm not aware of his background, but if he's writing for this magazine, he's typical evangelical. He says, it looked as though they would not be able to, in any way whatever, to establish themselves as a nation again. Then God began to work and the war came. If you want my explanation of the war, I believe there was one object which God had in view, as God always has an object in view, and that object was that he might deal with Israel. I believe that was the real purpose that God had in permitting the war to take place. It was not until the peoples of the world had done something for Israel that God permitted the war to stop. End of quote. Wilson says it's not surprising that believers in the sovereignty of God would refrain from attacking the method that God uses in achieving his purposes, but it seems tragic that such discussions pass without even a slight lament for over 8 million dead human beings. God's purposes were costly. This involved not just the physical losses of sons, fathers, husbands, and sweethearts, but for the most part, the relegation of eternally lost souls to the unending punishment of hell, according to most premillenarians' doctrine. Although God was given the credit for the purposes accomplished by the war, a congregational minister, writing in Moody Bible Institute Monthly, assigned all blame to the devil. Quote, "While evil abounds, God restrains. In the hours of this age, when hell-born forces seemed about to triumph, God has restrained. In the late World War, he restrained. Bad as it was not as bad as it would have been if Germany had won. God heard our prayer and had mercy upon us. He, not we, beat back the foe." End of quote. This inconsistency of giving God the credit but not the blame is, of course, the age-old Christian dilemma of the origin of evil. The discussions of the premillenarians appear particularly simplistic and naive, as this dilemma was not even mentioned. Even beyond the immediate objective of retrieving the promised land for Israel, the war was recurringly interpreted as having another end in view. Quote, "The recent war was a great rehearsal for the final war of Armageddon." Unquote. The saga of the capture of Jerusalem continued to grow, making General Allenby into somewhat of a folk hero among premillenarians. He was joined to the ranks of the Maccabeans of the pre-Christian era, and was to be joined later by the hero of the 1967 war, Moshe Dayan. A speaker at the 1922 Southern Baptist Convention contrasted the elaborate preparations for the assault on the city with the ease of the capture without the shedding of blood. Sir Henry Galway's account of how Allenby had made up his mind beforehand that he would not damage the holy places was retold. Allenby telegraphed the British government. The government told him to do what he thought best. He then telegraphed the king. The king told him to pray about it. So Allenby assembled his troops and prayed for special guidance. And before the meeting was over, the message arrived that the Turks had withdrawn. One writer exclaimed, quote, "The fiendish Turk was chased out, and Jerusalem was taken without a gun having been fired upon or in the city. This was the work of God." Unquote. This sequence of events was attributed to the fulfillment of prophecy. The certainty of Israel's return was given anecdotal illustration. And now he has a quote from someone called French Oliver in the magazine The King's Business. "The Turks, during the days of the Crusaders, coined a saying, 'The Christians will take Jerusalem when the river Nile flows into Palestine.' That meant that they would never take Jerusalem. God heard the challenge of the Turks, and the only good thing I have ever known the great oil company of America to do was done in this connection. They placed a great quantity of pipe for a pipeline near the Suez Canal. When the British forces started for Palestine, they commandeered the pipe and began to pump the water from the Nile up to their troops. On and on they went, and finally they were pumping the river Nile into Palestine, and the Turks lost the land. There are some people who have so little sense as to deny the divine inspiration of the Bible." End of quote from French Oliver. Wilson concludes this section with another story that continued to circulate was the return of the latter rain. In articles in the Evangel magazine, just over 3 months apart, one article spoke of the return of the rains after God had withheld them for 2,000 years, whereas the other referred to a 1,000-year drought. Neither provided any supporting evidence, and both failed to mention that rainfall records had been kept for only the past 80 years. There is no evidence of significant changes in Palestinian climate during historical times. As a matter of fact, average yearly rainfall in the 1920s was the lowest on record. I'll put in a link to what J.C. Ryle had to say in his commentaries on the Synoptic Gospels way back in the 1840s and 50s. He had mentioned that the Gentile times would likely soon end, but he put no date on it, unlike some people that we read about. So his commentary on the Gentile times and their significance and what would follow them. See you soon.